Okay, we're on chapter 4, the flow of food. So the first stage of the flow of food before it comes into your establishment is to make sure that you have a proper vendor. And once it comes in, it has to be checked in by the storeroom manager, the purchasing manager, whoever you assign to check in all of your orders for fresh protein, seafood, and produce. When these items come in, we want to take the temperature. So the first stage in the HACCP plan is to order from an approved vendor, and then you always take your temperatures when the food comes in from the loading dock. And we have a type of thermometer that we use. It's a it's like a gun. You pull the handle, and it's a laser that automatically will go through frozen chicken, fish, anything that is frozen when it comes in. It'll go through and take the correct temperatures. So if you're getting a case of chicken, it's packed 24 in crushed ice, you can take the temperature of the middle, the back, or even the bottom of the case as it comes in. So the HACCP plan is to keep food safe throughout the flow of food. We said it always starts with the menu. So the first stage is writing your menu and deciding what type of product you're going to use. So what's your specification for each food item? We've said that using examples, if you're making chicken salad, what type of chicken are you going to buy? Is it going to be pre-cooked, fresh, raw? Are you going to boil whole chickens? So whatever you're going to do, you have to determine that, write your purchasing list, and then when you order, you're going to make sure that it's the right spec for you and the right temperature to hold that food product. So this is known as the HACCP plan, Hazardous Analysis Critical Control Points, following the flow of food. So it's time temperature. We're trying to prevent abuse of that time temperature, keeping food cold at 40 degrees and keeping food hot at over 135 degrees. We said the norm is probably 140. So cross-contamination is when you're using equipment or utensils and cutting boards. Don't cut chicken on the same board that you can then go cut fresh vegetables. So cross-contamination would be cross-contaminating the cutting board, the utensils, or anything that's used in this process. Okay, so food prep is when your food comes in and you're the storeroom clerk or the manager that's issuing the food that's being distributed throughout the production of food. You're going to distribute meat to the hot cook line, the prep or pantry cook, and they're going to determine what recipe they use that meat or seafood in. And once it's distributed from the warehouse or from the walk-in coolers to the prep areas, the prep cooks will take temperatures and record those temperatures. And that's the second step of the HACCP plan, is the flow of food through the production. So we prepare raw meat and fish and poultry at different times throughout the day. Sometimes the food is ready to eat. You might already buy a prepared chicken salad. So you still have to take the temperature, and you can use the laser thermoprobe gun by just pulling the handle, and it will take a temperature of the internal chicken salad in the case or in the tub or container that it's shipped to you. All right, so the temperature danger zone on this chart, it's 41 to 135. Most people will say 40 to 135. So if you see the thermometer there, the red means that this is the temperature danger zone. This is the temperature area range where pathogens grow, and you try to keep food out of those range for a certain period of time. So that means if we're 40 degrees, that's food that's held cold in the pantry or cold area, 140 or 135 and above. This is in the chef or cook hot area. If we're keeping food on a steam line, if we're keeping food in a hot storage unit, If you're doing a catered event and you're delivering food in a hot unit, you need to make sure that you have exact control of the temperature when you're delivering that food so guests don't get ill by having that food in the temperature danger zone. So as we work in the kitchen, we'll be using kitchen probes. You'll be checking constant temperatures of the food. You want to make sure that you're holding the food correctly, cooking the food correctly, and that's why we're learning the internal temperatures of cooked meat, fish, seafood, poultry, or various proteins. Or when you go to reheat the food, that you reheat the food correctly. So the next step is to monitor. So once our food has been distributed to the prep area in the kitchen where it's going to be used, we take the temperature, we record it. So monitoring the temperatures. How often do we take the temperature? Who's responsible for monitoring and taking the temperature? Okay, so using the correct type of thermometers. So on your ServSafe test, it will ask you, what type of thermometers are you using? Are you using a probe? The probe has the little metal stick that you insert into food, and it will take a temperature. There are digital type probes. Then you have the thermal guns, which I was telling you about. So study the different types of probes that are used. And this is also on your test that you need to know. Here's the first one, the metal probe. You see these little dimples, or the dimples on the probe are what records the temperature. Underneath, you see the little bolt underneath the probe. You will be using this in class, and if you go to buy your own, how you calibrate this is there's a little bolt on the thermometer, and then you have a little plastic handle. And if you put it in ice water, and the little plastic handle has like it looks like a little wrench that goes around this little bolt, and you turn it slightly to 32 degrees if it's in cold water. If it's in boiling water, you bring it up to 212 degrees in boiling water. And if it's not correct, you take your plastic bowl wrench and you turn the bolt slightly, and it'll turn the needle to the correct temperature. So that's what's called the calibration nut. That's what that's referring to. And this is the most common one that we will be using in our kitchen lab. And we have a couple of them throughout the kitchen that we'll use and we share for different temperature probing. Okay, here's a digital probe. These are more accurate. The metal probe, same thing, it has a couple dimples. It goes into the food surface. Sometimes if you want to put like 2 pieces of frozen chicken, then you put the probe in between each 2 pieces. It'll also give you a temperature range. But these are mostly used for inserting into the food. Here's the thermal gun I was discussing with you. This is for using mostly on the loading dock for large cases and large food service establishments. They may order many cases of protein, and they would take the gun and shoot the outside of the box or remove the cover and shoot the food item, and then go into the middle and then to the bottom, taking temperatures throughout the various stacked cases so they can understand the temperatures and measurement of those temperatures. Please mute your mics, please. So these are time temperature indicators attached to packages. So you might get something attached to a plastic Cryovac bag that is on there from the manufacturer, and it just shows you a red line if it goes into the temperature danger zone. It shows you a green line if it stays in the correct temperature range. So when you're in the food service establishment, most cooks should have a probe in their pocket. So you walk around the kitchen, and the loading dock area, they should have the calibration laser gun. So everyone should have probes. In a lab, we have a couple that we share. They're not that expensive. In part of your knife kit, if you're going to stay in culinary in the kitchen or kitchen manager, you want to make sure you have a probe. You sanitize the dimple or the metal part of the probe, putting it into the sanitary solution. A lot of chefs, what they do is you have the wet naps that are the sanitary wet naps that they're in the sealed little containers. What we used to do is you just pierce the wet nap through the package, and then you wipe it down and pull it off, and it sanitizes your probe. You always want to make sure that you're checking the calibration on a regular basis. So we wanted to make sure we know the internal temperatures of meat. So here in this picture, they're probing a porterhouse or a T-bone steak. The internal temperature of a well-done steak is 140 degrees, 145, medium to medium well. So that means you're going to have, with carryover cooking, the steak is going to be a little bit more done than most people may like it. A lot of people like a medium rare, so it'll just be a little bit under 140 degrees. Okay, so always remember you have carryover cooking when you're cooking the food and inserting the probe. Okay. So we said the first step in the flow of HACCP was purchasing. So many of you may end up in positions where you become purchasing agent in your large hotel chains or your large food service establishment, and hospitals, healthcare, college, university, even your large stadiums. This Thursday, the NFL is going to start back up with their the football season, and all the stadiums that will start opening up, the restaurants and the food service areas, and many of them have one person that does all the purchasing for those areas. So they have to get the specs from the chefs, kitchen managers, beverage managers, all the specs for the menus and the recipes that they're going to need food and beverage supplies for. So you would have a designated purchasing person that would work with approved vendors and suppliers to purchase the food product that you need. So the criteria in the kitchen is set by the chef or the kitchen manager. You look at your menu, you say, here's the specs that I want. I want USDA grade choice, yield grade 3 steaks. And how many ounces do you want each steak? I want so many ounces on this New York strip cut steak. I want it to be boneless. I want the tail off. I want a marble grade of 3. So you would actually write down that spec. And most chefs would actually have a picture. They would have the vendor name, because what they've done, cuttings is what we call it. Cuttings are, we get different types of products in from the vendor, and we cut, we cook, we have our team taste, we look at the product, and we all decide that this is the best item that we want to use for our menu. And then you would say, this is the standard, this is what we want. And then you would have a substitute item in case this product is not available. Right now with COVID and everything that's going on in the industry right now, there's a lot of shortages. So I read an article the other day with Cisco Foods, who's one of the prime vendors in our industry, is running short on a lot of items because we all know what's happening in the world. And we're seeing that the ports now are getting less shipments. The containers now that they need to ship the food product in from various parts of the world are in supply, short demand. We're seeing that a lot of the manufacturers now, because employees are getting COVID, there's less production. So there's shortages. And when these shortages happen, you have to go to your purchasing agent and say, here's the secondary spec or a backup item that we'd want in case we can't get the main item that we want for that recipe or for that item that's menued. Anything that you receive in the shipping area, we always label and date. So in our lab in the kitchen, you're going to see that we have labeling dates, that you write the date that something is prepped. Most of your food distribution companies now have label and dates and UP codes that tell you, when you scan that code, it tells you who the manufacturer is, when it was packaged, when it was shipped, and the use by date. And this is standard on most already prepped foods. So make sure your vendors are approved. So as the chef or the kitchen manager or the restaurant manager, you're going to work with your team create the specifications, which are designed from the menu, write who the vendor is. You're going to actually do a par sheet. A par sheet means this is how many of this item we need to have on hand to prep. And then we need to have a backup of how much can be shipped. And we need to have a lead time. Lead time means I don't want to run out of this product. I need to always have a certain amount on hand. If I do run out, what's the lead time for that product to be shipped? And this is all established by the chef, the kitchen manager, or the restaurant GM working with the purchasing agent or the person who is going to buy the food. And you would have an actual purchase list. You break it down into proteins, produce, dairy, meat, cheeses, and which is part of your proteins, and dairy would be your cheeses, and then your groceries. And you keep the spec. You have a yield, the quantity, and the lead time of how much you want on hand. And you write all of that information for the purchasing agent, and they would have it on a regular basis. They would know when to purchase that. Now, if you're working in a large convention center, when I was doing the luau in Hawaii, we were ordering, we were feeding 10,000 people a week just the luau. You're getting large deliveries, an amount of deliveries. So you always had to have a backup specification because many times it ran out of the type of fish that we want. We actually had this spec on chicken thighs on actually how we wanted them boned, cleaned, or bone in, and what the actual weight was and the pack weight. And we found out that one of our vendors, which changed our specification, and we realized that after the second time we tried to cook them, and then we went to the vendor and said, this isn't our spec. And they said, well, we can no longer get your spec. Our vendor, our meat supplier is not shipping them to us. So then you have to recalculate and figure, do I need a new vendor or what do I do? So when they come into the back loading dock of the storage area, you inspect the quality, you inspect the yield, you take the temperature, and this is all done by the person that receives the food coming into the back loading dock. So make sure everyone knows what your specs are as a chef, what your quality standards are. A lot of restaurants, the people just sign off on the invoice and they don't go through and check the produce. And you'll get known as a reputation with vendors that, hey, they don't even check anything. So when a vendor has something that's produce that's, borderline acceptable, they're going to ship it to the places that don't check their produce or they don't look at it. And might get one day, if it's a tomato as in this picture, you might get one day out of it because the tomatoes are near rotten or they're not as good, where you want something that's you're going to get, a week's worth out of that tomato for shelf life. So when you have hours of operation, you work with your key deliveries. You don't want a driver dropping food off right in the middle of your lunch or dinner rush. So you tell them, here's when I am willing to accept orders. A lot of your vendors will show right up at noontime and they, could be your key protein deliverer where you get 20 to 30 cases and they want you to stop everything you're doing to accept those supplies. So you have to be very strict. And if a driver shows up, a lot of times they'll make them wait and say, hey, we have to get through service, or you have to tell them to come back, that you're in the middle of service. Right now with COVID going on, you have to really be flexible because a lot of shortages of drivers in a lot of these companies now. And just like every other industry, they're short drivers because of COVID. Drivers are out sick or they need to hire more drivers. And so during this time right now, we have to be flexible. But during peak period when everything was normal, a lot of times chefs would tell the drivers to come back because they're right in the middle of service and they can't check anything in. And eventually the drivers and the suppliers know what restaurants they can go to at what specific times. Many times you're going to reject food items and you're going to send them back. You either only wanted one out of the item. A lot of times your vendors break cases. Let's say you have 6 cans to a case. If you want 1 can, the vendor will break a case and only send 1 can. Many times they send the whole case, and your case will last you forever, and it's very expensive item, so you'll send them back. Other times the produce isn't acceptable. It's not up to your specs, and you're the purchasing agent, and you know the chef will get very upset with you because you didn't accept the food product the way they wanted it. So they're going to reject it, and then you set that off to the side. You get the driver to circle the item, write on the item that is being returned. Of course, today everything is computerized, so the driver can input right away on his handheld iPad or handheld computer and reject it right away and give you credit right away and print out a new invoice. Years ago, we just used to circle the item and then have the driver initial it. But today, with the way computers are and iPads, they correct your invoice right away at that time. So you get a new updated invoice deleting the rejected item. There are items that are recalled, which we see on a regular basis. Just a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the Italian meats that are recalled. Everything has a UP number. The UP number will tell you the date it was packed, the manufacturer, where it came from, what warehouse, etc. And that's how when you go on national TV and they say, if you purchase this food product from this particular vendor, it's been recalled. And you can get an updated list emailed to you as a chef, a manager, or a purchasing agent through the USDA. They have a recall website, a link that tells you all the updates of the food that's been recalled. So you want to take it out of inventory, you want to send it back to the manufacturer, or if the manufacturer tells you to destroy it, you'll take a picture of the package and store it on your, save it on your drive to make sure you have all that information. What you do not want to do is to try to reuse that product or cook it and serve it. If it says that's recalled, you get rid of it. All right, here's a digital probe checking the internal temperature of chicken breast. Internal temperature should be 40 or just below, 38 to 40. Okay. Okay, so here's a Cryovac food, processed food. Sous vide is a method of cryovacing food before it is cooked. Sous, remember, means under, so it's under plastic, under cryovac. Many states now, if you're doing sous vide, you have to have a special license and certificate from a health department. Years ago, chefs just used to do sous vide on their own. They didn't have to have any certifications or license to do it. It's basically taking cryovac food that are seasoned in brines or liquids or dry rubs and cooking into a special cryovac unit at a very slow temperature. It's like steaming it or boiling it, slow cooking it, and then you take internal temperatures and record them. And what it said is, what it's believed is that it seals in the juices and keeps the moisture in. But in many states, you have to have approval from your local health department to do sous vide. So here they're using a probe in the package. If you had a laser thermal thermometer, you would just shoot the outside of the box and it would give you an internal temperature. Okay, when you go to get temperature controlled food, here it's showing you a red snapper, taking the temperature of the fish. You'd want to check the eyes of the fish, make sure they're not cloudy, make sure they're clear. You want to check the gills to make sure they're not gray, they're bright, they're pink, and it's a fresh looking fish. Now, when this fish here is stored in shaved ice, a lot of chefs, what they'll do is they'll take the ice and put it in plastic bags and cover the fish and certain fish so it doesn't freeze the outside of the fish. And we do that a lot with shellfish. And we'll show you how to store that in class when we're working with those. But out in the industry, it's very important that you keep your fish ice cold, especially right now in Florida with 90 degrees and very hot outside and humid. A lot of your raw bars now, you have to make sure that a lot of ice and constantly taking temperature. Again, remember with your shellfish, you have to keep the tags for 90 days in a file. The tags are going to come, they're going to tell you where the shellfish came from, what waters they came from, who harvested them, and the date they were harvested. So on your ServSafe test, it's going to ask you, how shellfish is stored and how many days you have to hold on to the tag. 90 days is the correct answer. You have to hold on to the tag when receiving shellfish. Okay, when we receive eggs, remember the USDA, in the United States Department of Agriculture is responsible for the inspection of eggs. They have the grading, grade A, large, medium, small, petite. So when you go to the grocery store, you all know when you buy them, you look at them, you look for USDA grade. Now they're AA grade or triple grade. So the more grading and the larger the size, the better the quality of the egg. And these are all inspected. Some of the eggs have individual stamps on them, or the carton will have the information and the stamp on them. Okay, and they do have a shelf life, and we do have to take the internal temperature. Okay. Okay, any frozen food that are delivered to you, we look for no freezer burns. We make sure food that hasn't been thawed and refrozen, or we make sure if we're getting a case, you might get a case of frozen shrimp. Some of it is thawed and some of it's frozen. You would reject that because it could be sitting in contaminated water or it could have been refrozen. Look for packaging with tear holes in the package. Look for bloated cans. A bloated can will tell you that it could have bacteria or pathogenic growth in it. It could be botulism, we talked about, ready-to-eat processed foods, right? Make sure they're packaged and sealed correctly. Broken carton or seals, you automatically reject them. Discolored packages or packages that are rusty, mold, stained, automatically reject them. Okay, here's the tags for the shellfish. 90 days. Very important that you understand this. This is on your ServSafe exam. Remember, we talked about fish there's no national inspection for fish. So salmon, grouper, mahi-mahi, dolphin fish, any of these type of fresh fish, tuna, there is no USDA inspection. So we have to inspect it ourselves when it comes to the back loading docks. We check those, and you could get a fisherman to bring fish right to the back dock. In Hawaii, we had them coming up with the ahi tuna right to the back door, and we as chefs would check it, look at it. Now, farm-raised fish or packaged fish is a different story. If you're buying individually quick frozen, IQF fish, farm-raised, and it's sent to you by your distributor in a 10 to 25 pound box, you have to follow the FDA standards of where it was manufactured, where it was farmed, and how it was packaged. So that's a different scenario. We're talking about fresh fish. We're talking about fish that could be caught right here in Florida, right off the water. You're allowed to use it and sell it on your menu as long as you inspect it and you look for the gills, look for the eyes. Check. Ask the fisherman when the last time it was caught. Okay. Check the labels on ready-to-eat processed food. Store properly. We said dry stores go in dry storage. Paper goes in paper. Chemicals will go in chemical. You know, if you have one walk-in cooler, you separate your produce from your fish, from your protein. A lot of your large establishments will have separate cooler for each item. Protein goes in one, produce in another, dairy in another. This is the ideal situation for large convention centers and banquets and healthcare facilities. If you do not have the ability to do that, then you need to separate out in the cooler with your shelving. So this shelf will be for proteins. This shelf will be for dairy. This shelf will be for produce. And cooked foods always go above raw. Produce always goes above raw. So on your top of your shelf, if you have a small cooler and you had to store produce and protein together, your produce would go on the top, your raw food would go on the bottom, your cooked food would go in the middle. So produce, cooked food. Cooked food means ready to eat food that you're going to heat up and serve. On the bottom will be your raw food. You don't want raw chicken sitting on top of lettuce or ready-to-eat foods and reheating, because the raw chicken could have salmonella and it could drip wet water contaminated on top of the other foods. We always date our foods. Temperature-controlled foods are always dated. So we prep the food, we take our labels, which in our labs we have labels. So anything that's prepped, you label, you date it, and what it is, and you put it into the cooler. Everything is marked. Everything is dated. Ready-to-eat temperature-controlled food, always dated, rotated. When's the use-by date if it's packaged and you received a packaged food? So it'll have a use-by date. If you're buying food in large food service establishments, let's say you're buying prepared lasagnas, pastas, or casseroles, make sure they all have a date, a use-by date, the UP code. If you scanned it, it would tell you who the manufacturer is and where it came from. Keeping food stored outside of the TDZ zone, temperature danger zone. Do not overload freezers. That's very important in a small establishment. That's why you look at the menu and you say, this is how much I want on hand. This is my par stock. The par stock means this is the minimum we have on hand, knowing your lead time for delivery. So if I sell 10 items a day, I want to have 12 items on day. If I run out of those 10 items, I always want to have 2 on hand for my lead time, knowing it takes me 3 days to get fresh product in. That's why a lot of chefs in a lot of your fine dining restaurants, they get seafood delivered every day or every other day. They don't want it staying in their coolers. Your fine dining establishments, the freezer is a small space in the establishment because the chef wants fresh meat and protein and delivered every day, fresh produce every other day, to make sure that it's the best, freshest ingredients available. Rotate, FIFO, first in, first out. This is an acronym that you need to know. It will be on your ServSafe exam. First in, first out means that the freshest items always go in the back. Whenever I go grocery shopping, I always reach into the back of the cooler because I know that when they rotate the product, the oldest milk or oldest dairy items they push to the front so the consumer will buy the oldest dated product first so that it sells. It rotates. And that's why I reach my hand in the back to grab the freshest item to make sure that I get the newest product. Prevent cross-contamination. Another area that you need to know is that your shelving has to be 6 inches from the floor. This will be on your ServSafe manager's exam. So when you set your storerooms up and in the cooler, you want to make sure the first shelf is 6 inches from the floor. Very important that you understand that. Cross-contamination, store food in sealed containers, keeping them separate. Make sure your food is wrapped appropriately. I like to use Ziploc bags, and we label and date each Ziploc bag with the food ready to eat. Okay, here's the storage. You'll notice that the cooked or produce is on top. Raw meat is on the bottom. You'll have a question on your ServSafe exam. It'll give you an example of different food products, a lettuce, a cooked ready-to-eat food, and then a raw meat, and you'll have to go and categorize each one as correctly and how they would be stored. Never store foods in a locker room. My daughter was eating in a restaurant one time, and she went to use the restroom, and she walked in, and they had buns proofing in that area, back where you went to the bathrooms. And that was a big health violation. So she never ate in that restaurant again. So don't store food in locker rooms, restrooms, mechanical rooms where the electrical supplies are, or the air conditioning units are. Okay, these are very uncontaminated or unsafe areas to store food.